When the world's finance ministers gather in Washington each spring, all the attention is normally on this building on my left, the International Monetary Fund. But this year, those finance ministers ought to spare a thought as well for the building behind me, the World Bank. That's because the World Bank is currently engaged in a really massive restructuring. And based on what my sources tell me, that restructuring is causing a huge amount of internal discontent.
The restructuring is the brainchild of Jim Yong Kim, who came in as president of the World Bank nearly 2 years ago after a contentious selection battle. Mr. Kim was the US candidate, and by tradition, the US always appoints the head of the World Bank. But he had to win past two developing country rivals. Mr. Kim won through, but it was never clear what it was he wanted to do with the World Bank. As it's turned out, his plan is a three-part restructuring. There are $400 million in cost cuts, a financial overhaul, and the bank is shifting from a structure based on 6 regions to one with 14 global practices, such as agriculture or health. The idea is to break down silos in the regions and to free up lending capacity so the bank can lend more to its various developing country customers. The thing is, the bank's problems are strategic, so the question is whether the restructuring really solves them. The bank used to be the only game in town for developing countries, but nowadays countries such as China are swimming in capital, and they'll lend it to other developing countries as well as use it themselves, so the bank is increasingly in competition with its own clients. It's a bit like Microsoft confronted with the internet, or Kodak confronted with the digital camera. Does restructuring and cost-cutting really solve that problem, or do you need a more fundamental rethink? Added to that is the bitterness of the restructuring itself. In reporting a recent FT piece, I heard stories about dozens of managers forced to reapply for their own jobs, 3 of the most senior being pushed out without much explanation. Expensive management consultants, the sudden scrapping of this year's PhD recruitment programme when it was 7 months in and hundreds of people had already applied. That bitterness was reflected in the number of people who also complained to me about Mr. Kim personally. Some of these things were matters of perception, like the fact that Mr. Kim has sometimes used private jets on his international travel. He hasn't done so all that often, but it looks awful when you're cutting costs and at an institution that's dedicated to helping the world's poorest people. Some other staff said that he's not sufficiently engaged with international finance ministries, another important part of the job.
Restructurings often cause a lot of discontent. It's no surprise that there are angry people inside the World Bank now as their jobs are shuffled around. But the World Bank is a truly important institution, so the world will be watching to see whether Mr. Kim's restructuring is a success or not.